They say America was built on family values, but beneath that smiling portrait, the Sunday dinners, the wedding portraits, the hand-me-down silverware, there are photographs too stained for daylight, hidden in basements, locked in attics, whispered through family lines like curses that refuse to die. Tonight we're opening those boxes, and what's inside may never let you sleep the same again. Because before there were Hollywood scandals or royal betrayals, there were the American families who looked at blood and called it love. The first story doesn't begin in a mansion, but in a cabin, deep in the Appalachian woods of Kentucky, where isolation was not a punishment, but a way of life. The Fugate family, known for their blue skin, centuries of intermarriage had left their bloodline visibly marked, their bodies carrying the sign of generations that married within their own. A medical mutation, yes, but also a metaphor carved into flesh. When a family closes itself off from the world eventually carves its way in. They weren't alone. Across the South, remote mountain families blurred the line between kinship and courtship. What began as survival, limited choices, distance from towns, slowly became tradition. Uncles marrying nieces, cousins binding bloodlines tighter with each generation until even the children bore the weight of inherited guilt. Yet perhaps what's most disturbing isn't what they did, but how ordinary it became, how families learned to justify it, how ministers turned their eyes away. The notion of family purity twisted into something unrecognizable, something almost ritualistic. The same prayers at the table, the same hymns on Sunday, except everyone in the church knew whose daughter belonged to whom. And when outsiders came, when the truth tried to claw its way out, these families didn't confess. They protected the lie. They protected the blood. In the end, it's easy to point a finger at them, those poor, forgotten mountain families, but America itself was built on obsession with lineage, wasn't it? Bloodlines, heritage, legacy. The Fugates were just the reflection of that dream turned inside out. A family so determined to preserve itself, it became its own prison. In the late 1800s, when America's new aristocracy was being born, marriage wasn't about love, it was about preservation. Old money guarded itself like a secret religion. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the DuPonts, names that shimmered with luxury, but hid a rot too proud to admit itself. Because when power and pride intertwine, even bloodlines become property. One of the most unsettling stories comes from the DuPont family. For generations they built an empire on gunpowder, fortune and control. But within those sprawling estates, something darker brewed, an obsession with blood purity that blurred into something almost medieval. Cousins marrying cousins wasn't taboo, it was policy. They called it keeping the blood strong. What they were really keeping was a cycle of madness, paranoia, and quiet decay. Behind those marble walls, the family lineage became a cage. The descendants were born into luxury, but trapped inside a dynasty that feared dilution more than damnation. It's said that some DuPont children were raised to believe no one outside the family could ever truly understand them, let alone be worthy of them. So they married inward, again and again, until the brilliance that once built empires began to crumble under its own genetic weight. By the 20th century, the price of that arrogance began to show. Mental illness ran like a shadow through the halls, generations born sick, brittle, strange. The once great family name whispered in connection to violence and instability. It was as if the ghosts of their ancestors had turned on them, whispering reminders that no amount of money could erase what had been done in the name of legacy. And the truth? They weren't the only ones. The practice wasn't confined to the forgotten corners of Appalachia or the gilded halls of Delaware. Across the country, families tied by land, by money, or by reputation all turned inward. A quiet epidemic of incestuous unions masked beneath polished family portraits and polite dinner parties. What makes it all so haunting isn't just what these people did, it's what they believed. That love could be owned, that blood could be purified, that lineage could be perfected, even as it corroded from within. And yet in the quiet corners of America's oldest families, that same whisper still lingers, a whisper that says, "We are different, we are chosen, we are ours." If the DuPonts were a warning written in gold, the Benders of Kansas were a warning written in blood. Their story is one of the earliest examples of how a family could twist its bonds into something unholy. In the 1870s, the Benders lived along the Osage Trail. A husband, wife, son, and daughter, or so they claimed. They ran a small inn for travelers heading west. People came, paid for supper, and were never seen again. The family that welcomed them was not a family by love, but a pact by need. Their so-called son and daughter were likely not blood relatives at all, but partners in a shared sickness. Still, they called themselves kin, and that word gave them cover. Their victims were travelers, farmers, families, ordinary souls looking for rest. What awaited them instead was a trapdoor beneath the dining table and a hammer swung from behind the curtain. The Benders buried dozens beneath their orchard. The soil drank what their hearts had long forgotten, and when the killings were discovered, they vanished, like a curse dissolving into the prairie wind. But what the Benders revealed wasn't just horror, it was the fragility of the American family myth, the idea that blood equals trust, that kinship equals safety. Because behind that false smile of domestic unity lies something primal, the instinct to survive, even if it means devouring one's own. And across the centuries, that instinct would echo in quieter ways, in the hidden marriages that fused cousins into spouses, uncles into fathers-in-law, daughters into heirs. Different acts, same motive, to keep something in the family. Whether that meant land, wealth, or simply control, the result was always the same. A circle tightening around itself until it strangled its own heart. The Benders' story ends in mystery. Some say they escaped to Texas. Others believe they were hunted down and buried in secret. But maybe that was fitting, because families like the Benders never truly die. They just change their names, move towns, and keep pretending. What if the most disturbing part isn't what they did, but how easily they hid among everyone else? How many families smile across the dinner table, pretending their history isn't rotting just beneath their feet? There's a kind of horror that doesn't come from violence but from devotion, from families who love each other so much they begin to worship their own blood. And nowhere did that devotion curdle more grotesquely than in the story of the Colt family of rural New England. The Colts were never famous, never powerful, not like the DuPonts or the Astors. But what they built in secret was just as insidious, a generational labyrinth of incest and control that turned an ordinary surname into a curse whispered by neighbors. For decades they lived in seclusion, marrying and bearing children within the same extended circle until the family tree folded back on itself. When authorities finally uncovered the truth in the 2010s, an entire compound of relatives living in filth, some unable to identify who their real parents were. It was as if a ghost from the 1800s had stepped into the modern world. DNA tests revealed the impossible. Brothers were fathers, mothers were cousins, children were both niece and daughter. An entire family had been swallowed by its own bloodline, lost to generations of self-preservation masquerading as love. The most disturbing detail wasn't just the genetic entanglement, it was the silence. No one spoke. No one ran. The younger ones didn't even understand what was wrong. They had been born into a reality where this was normal, where boundaries never existed, where the family's word was law. And that silence echoes through history. Because every era has its cults, its hidden clans who live behind curtains drawn tight, convinced that keeping the world out will keep them pure. They forget that isolation breeds not holiness, but hunger. The Colt family became a modern parable of decay, a reminder that darkness doesn't die with time. It just waits for another name, another fence line, another generation willing to call their prison a home. It's easy to look away, to pretend such stories belong to another century, but these families prove otherwise. Blood worship is timeless. It's the American obsession reborn in every family that fears the outside world more than it fears itself. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run or would you stay loyal? There's a sickness that doesn't always show in the body. It festers in memory, in inheritance, in the quiet laws passed down through generations. And perhaps nowhere was that sickness more sanctified than in the early 20th century, when America dressed its darkest instincts in the language of science. They called it eugenics, a movement built on the belief that purity could be engineered, that inferior bloodlines could be cleansed. It was the same logic that justified family marriages for centuries, just rewritten in medical ink. Families who once whispered about keeping their line pure now had the endorsement of universities, doctors, even the government. The old sin became a policy. In Virginia, the so-called fitter families competitions awarded trophies to those deemed genetically superior, often white, wealthy, and of good stock. Behind the smiling photographs were families who proudly traced their lineage to prove that no outsider's blood had tainted it. What they didn't see was that their pride was a mirror of the very madness they feared. Some of those same families encouraged cousins to marry, to preserve heritage. Ministers blessed the unions, newspapers celebrated them. The obsession had become national ritual, wrapped in respectability, but pulsing with the same ancient fear of difference. And while America pointed to the poor, to the isolated, calling them degenerate, its own upper classes were quietly practicing the same incestuous arithmetic under another name. They called it breeding. They called it improvement. But behind those euphemisms was the same haunting need to keep control. The horror wasn't just biological, it was ideological. A faith that told people they could curate humanity, prune their family tree until only the right branches remained. What they created instead was a garden of ghosts, children born broken, families collapsing under the weight of inherited pride, bloodlines that looked perfect on paper but hollowed themselves from within. And as the eugenics movement faded into disgrace after the Second World War, the families who once supported it rewrote their histories. The photographs vanished from mantels, the records burned, yet the ideology, the worship of blood, the fear of dilution, never truly disappeared. It just became quieter, subtler, woven into the stories families tell themselves about where they come from. Somewhere between secrecy and shame, there lies another kind of family, one that hides its horror not through isolation or ideology, but through ritual. The ones who turn their homes into shrines, their bloodlines into prophecies. And in that darkness, the line between marriage and sacrifice becomes blurred. In the early 1900s, deep in the Ozarks, there lived a family known by locals as the Kindreds. That wasn't their real name, of course. Most of the official records were lost or destroyed, but what remained of their story reads like something torn from a fever dream. They believed themselves chosen, descended from a sacred bloodline meant to remain unbroken. To them, outsiders were contamination, temptation, ruin. The Kindreds intermarried for decades. Cousins, sometimes half-siblings, bound together in secret ceremonies beneath the hollow moon. Their union wasn't for love, it was for preservation. They believed that their blood carried divine purpose, and every birth was a reaffirmation of that myth. But as the years passed, the children grew sickly, the minds fractured. Whispers spread of voices in the woods, of family members kept in locked rooms to protect the gift. When an anthropologist stumbled upon the remnants of their homestead in the 1950s, the journals she found spoke of purification through closeness, of the blood that must never forget itself. Those words were scrawled beside biblical verses, sometimes smeared with what looked like candle wax, or worse. By the time the property was reclaimed by the state, nothing was left but collapsed foundations and stories too strange for newspapers to print. Yet some nearby families still refused to go near the land after sundown. They said the earth there was cursed, not by demons, but by memory, by what people do when they convince themselves they are holy. And maybe that's what ties all these stories together. From the mountains to the mansions, the same haunting truth pulses beneath. Once a family believes its blood is sacred, there is no line it won't cross to keep it that way. When love becomes doctrine, when pride becomes scripture, families stop being human, they become myth, and myths always demand sacrifice. The final story isn't about a single family, it's about the soil itself, how America has always been a graveyard of names that forgot where love ended and ownership began. Because every family we've unearthed tonight, the Fugates, the DuPonts, the Benders, the Colts, the Kindreds, weren't just stories, they were warnings, and we buried them, thinking the dirt would keep them quiet. But history doesn't stay buried, it seeps. It seeps through bloodlines, through silence, through the way people still talk about good stock and strong families. It lives in the way we whisper that some families are better than others, as if worth could be inherited like eye color. That's the true haunting, how the sickness survives in our language long after we think we've outgrown it. When you trace America's history through its most disturbing unions, what you find isn't a collection of freakish outliers, it's a mirror, a reflection of a nation obsessed with purity, ownership, and control. A country that preaches freedom but builds its foundations on bloodlines that refuse to mix. Even now, in the present day, those echoes remain. Genetic testing kits mailed out like fortune tellers, promising to tell us who we really are. But what happens when those results come back and you realize the story you were told was never true, that the family Bible lied, that the faces in those old portraits weren't husband and wife, but something far more tangled? That's the secret most families fear, not monsters in the attic, but history itself. Because if you dig long enough, you find that every family, no matter how ordinary, has its shadow, and some of those shadows stretch farther than blood, reaching into what America itself has always been running from. So maybe the most disturbing marriages in American history aren't just the ones recorded in court documents or family trees. Maybe they're those silent ones, between pride and denial, between legacy and guilt, the ones we still live with, the ones that never ended. And when you look at your own family photographs, the weddings, the smiles, the generations gathered on porches, ask yourself this: what stories were never told? What was left out of the frame?